This is the McKinsey podcast, where we help you make sense out of our world's toughest business challenges.
Welcome to the show. I'm Lucia Rahili.
And I'm Roberta Fasaro.
The choices you make and the conditions you create that actually allow your ambition to thrive. Because just as somebody might have a big ambition to get fit, if you don't have access to the right equipment, the right nutrition, you probably will not get as fit as you want.
That's McKinsey Senior Partner Tunde Olanrewaju. He joins me and Senior Partner Andrew Goodman to talk about the 5 conditions that top-performing UK companies create to realize their plans for growth.
In our second segment, the best ways CEOs can lead through a merger and acquisition, with Senior Partner Mika Veno-Standa from our CEO Insight series.
Most people look at the stock market to understand how a country is doing economically. If you were to look at the UK stock market, you might believe things aren't going so well. And that's partly true, says Tunde.
The UK stock market, in the guise of the FTSE, has actually not performed as strongly as some of the other stock markets across the world, particularly if you look at the US stock market. Now, it's easy to then draw the conclusion that there's something, therefore, less strong about the UK economy. So what we actually did, first of all, was just step back and say, if you look at some of the broader factors that define an economy beyond the stock market, how's the UK doing?
McKinsey's latest research found that there are bright spots in the UK economy that might not be completely visible to all. Over the past 15 years, for example, a lot of private capital has flowed into the UK market. Tunde says it's in the trillions.
By the last count we saw in the data, with something like $1.8 trillion of private equity investments and $0.95 trillion of foreign direct investment has actually flowed into the UK economy. That has gone into, in some cases, taking companies private, so delisting them from the London Stock Exchange and taking them private. It's come from international companies buying UK companies.
The upshot here is that the FTSE doesn't completely reflect what's going on with UK companies. McKinsey Senior Partner Andrew Goodman says that's why McKinsey created the UK 500, to take into consideration the entire UK corporate landscape.
The UK 500 as a composite that looks at the largest companies in the UK in terms of revenue. And alongside those public companies, the list also includes some of the largest private companies in the UK and some of the big subsidiaries of international companies that contribute a huge amount to the economy. Just to give you a bit of sense of scale, the UK 500 collectively is about $4 trillion of revenue kind of globally, and it's about $600 billion of EBITDA.
As McKinsey partners analyzed the companies in the UK 500, they found that some were doing better than others, especially when it comes to tech-driven innovation.
The thing that's striking about the UK is that it has a leading position in some of the areas of innovation that we think are going to be the most important in the global economy over time. 3 examples of that would be artificial intelligence, particularly clustered around DeepMind and some of the innovations that DeepMind has had. Bioengineering, particularly clustered around some of the research that Cambridge and other universities have done. In climate technology, where the UK has made some really kind of material investments. And it's pretty striking, for example, if you just start with AI, that the UK has the largest number of AI startups in Europe. And one thing that we've really seen as a core success factor for the UK has been able to exploit and scale and grow companies that are associated with those technologies.
McKinsey's research suggests that these high-performing companies have a particular kind of ambition. McKinsey calls it systematic ambition, which is
the choices you make and the conditions you create that actually allow your ambition to thrive. Because just as somebody might have a big ambition to get fit, if you don't have access to the right equipment, the right nutrition, you probably will not get as fit as you want, no matter how much in your mind you want to get fit.
McKinsey found that there are 5 conditions that these high-performing UK companies create for themselves, starting with finding like-minded investors.
Be clear that you've actually targeted a group of investors that align with the type of outcome that you want to create for the company. Otherwise, you'll always have that tension. This is not straightforward to do because you can't always choose who decides to invest in you. But by actually being clear what your stock stands for and being a little bit more purposeful who you're attracting and how you promote that proposition to them, we think over time you can shift it.
The second condition is about incentives, and this is both for the management team and the board.
In many UK boards, there isn't much stock incentivization, partly because of the way companies interpret the governance code, partly because of the way the governance code is actually intended. But as a result, it could in some cases lead to boards being more focused on managing downside and less focused on creating upside or pushing for upside within the company. And so we do think that the role of incentives does play a role in setting the aspirations of the leadership. And clearly the incentives at the top cascade into the rest of the organization.
In addition to incentives, the highest performing UK companies focus on 3 sources of growth, starting with
international markets, so more focus on geographic exploration.
Andrew agrees and says growth in markets outside the UK has driven about 85% of all the revenue growth of the largest UK businesses.
They're being really successful at growing their businesses in North America, elsewhere in Europe and in Asia. An example maybe that kind of brings that to life is Ashtead, which is in the business of renting out industrial equipment. They've really focused over the last 20 years on growth in North America, and the North American market now generates more than 90% of the revenue of that business overall.
Secondly, the adoption of technology, either in renovating the business model or in changing the way we went to market.
One example to sort of bring that to life, Rio Tinto, one of the world's largest resourcing companies, they estimate that each of the driverless trucks that they use in their operations could operate an additional 700 hours a year compared to a conventional truck. And that's really driving kind of higher productivity in some of the businesses.
And then thirdly, introducing new products and services rather than simply innovating in the existing products and services.
Those are the sources of growth. Now back to the conditions. Another one is building effective partnerships.
The first piece of that is partnering with innovators. Quite a lot of the successful companies were very effective at working with smaller companies to power their new ambitions, who were bringing new capabilities to power what the company was doing.
But big organizations have to be careful. They don't want to get in the way of startups or other small, innovative companies.
A lot of large institutions can be very difficult to work with if you're a small company, or will choke them with paperwork and all sorts of diligence that is ultimately not making anybody safer, but just actually puts a brake on innovation. So really looking about whether you've created the conditions for such companies to participate and help power your ambitions.
And it's people that power companies. Tunde says the workforce needs to be reskilled to create the fifth and final condition for outperformance.
Taking reskilling seriously was something we consistently saw. Picking out new capabilities that you really wanted to build, investing in people, and doing that on a regular basis meant that you started to create the conditions for new ambitions to be realized.
It will take time and management's attention to create these conditions, but for the companies that get it right, the opportunities are endless.
And I think some of the most exciting opportunities for corporates are where we see them partnering with those innovative AI players, biotech companies, kind of climate tech players. And we think that will be a durable source of competitive advantage for UK companies over the next 5 to 10 years.
Next up, senior partner Mika van Oostenden and managing editor Laurel Moglen discuss the critical role of a CEO during a merger and acquisition.
Mika, thanks so much for joining today.
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, just diving right in, what's the state of mergers and acquisitions, or M&A, today?
M&A is at an inflection point today. CEOs across industries tell us that M&A is more than ever a vital lever for them. Organic growth, which as a standalone strategy actually has never compared well to a combined strategy of organic and inorganic growth. And this is especially true when companies need to adapt quickly.
What kind of trends are you seeing in M&As in the recent past to now and across geographies?
The US is almost back at normal, at the higher levels we have seen in the era from 2014 to 2022. Europe has recovered, but much more slowly than the US and not yet back at the levels what it was. And Asia has declined their share in the total global M&A volume. If you then look at the type of deals, for 70-80% are still corporate deals. The rest are financial deals or private equity deals. PE is not yet back at what it used to be, especially not in Europe. We do know that something will need to happen in the PE world because we know that they're sitting on trillions and trillions of dry powder. So at some moment in time, this money needs to move. And then maybe from a sector perspective, that is honestly reasonably stable. The top three sectors are GEM or industrials, chemical sector is TMT, so tech, media, and telco. We see actually a huge consolidation wave in telecom across the world. And it's financial and professional services, still also including private equity.
Just to dig in a little bit more, what does inflection mean when there is such a variety across regions?
The inflection point is that we're living in a very volatile world, and CEOs came to the realization that this volatility is probably here to stay. This will not be solved in a matter of years. And at the same time, they will also need to do major shifts in their activity. One of the trends which are pushing them into that shift is sustainability, right? Like the reason why there are so many deals in the chemicals and industrials sector is because of the sustainability and the shift in portfolio which needs to happen. That's what we mean with an inflection point. Many of the companies are in front of a major shift in their portfolio, in their activity, in their industry, which they will probably in an organic way not be able to do in the right time frame at the right cost and so on.
McKinsey's research says that 50% of new CEOs of the S&P 500 launch a form of an M&A in their first 2 years. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So very early on, when they are CEO coming into the company, they want to make their mark, they want to make a shift. And again, M&A is one of the ways to make that shift. Two, M&A is very often only a starting point of something, of accelerating growth or accelerating capability building. And CEOs want to sit the full journey through so that they can see the impact of the acquisition or the divestment they have made. It was actually interesting. We have been interviewing a bunch of CEOs, and there was one CEO who said, if there's one thing I truly regret is that I have not done more M&A in the beginning of my career as a CEO.
What are the best practices you've seen CEOs do to shape the way they handle their M&As?
It might sound very obvious, but there's this notion of building a very clear M&A strategy, which is discussed and I would say validated by the board. The true successful CEOs then create buy-in, socialize the M&A strategy, and have a certain form of validation. Things can go much, much, much smoother and much faster. The second element is how should I be involved as a CEO? You cannot be in every deal. Smaller deals, there you empower your business units, your exco to truly take the lead on that deal. In those deals, it's important as a CEO that you form an opinion if you agree with the acquisition or not. But then, of course, for the more transformative, larger deals, there as a CEO, you're the captain of the ship. There you, of course, need to be fully involved. Because if there's one form of doubt at the top, the doubt will further, I would say, percolate in the organization. And the third thing is this notion of, one of our CEOs called it, I am a chief stakeholder officer. I need to manage the stakeholders, your own people, the regulator, the customers, of course, and not the least, the target company you want to acquire. And one of the critical elements I have seen successful CEOs do is truly spending time with the company they want to acquire, even potentially smaller companies, where the CEO just go and visit the target company to sit with the target CEO, because let's face it, although we try to bring M&A back to facts and figures and numbers, an M&A transaction to a certain extent is still a very emotional event, not only for the acquiring company, but for sure for the company who is being acquired.
Can you talk a little bit more about that emotional piece of an M&A transaction?
As a CEO, you do need to think through what are the more emotional elements which can make a deal succeed or not succeed. This is about location, very sensitive and emotional topic. Will my location headquarters be maintained or not be maintained? This is about, of course, branding, because the branding irradiates a part, of course, the company and potentially also part of yourself, especially if you have been the founder of the company. What do you do with that? So thinking through all of these elements and then thinking through how potentially the other side could react and see where can you maybe already give in on some of these elements, how will you structure the dialogue, and already recognizing those feelings, I think, in an M&A process is very important.
And as part of that process, can you share some examples of how CEOs have successfully addressed culture and how it might be changing?
I still remember when I did my first M&A transaction by now 17, 18 years ago, culture was defined as an activity on a Friday afternoon, and it was whether you shake a hand and you wear jeans on a Friday. That is, of course, not culture, right? And we have tried to dissect culture in this notion of mission and vision, values, and then management practices and behaviors. And the role of the CEO is, of course, to set the culture. He needs to role model also these management practices and behaviors he wants to see with his people and with his colleagues. I have seen in deals a shift of, for instance, a very decentralized model and way of managing towards a much more centralized way of working. The notion of installing a much more performance-driven, facts-based driven culture. The notion of you go from a local or a multi-local company to a more global international company, which then also coincides with much more unified processes and practices. The reason why I'm mentioning some of these examples is these are all pretty hardcore things, right? It's not about the fluffy, do I wear jeans on Friday?
How do the best CEOs communicate what's going on to all the various stakeholders and teams to keep up morale?
It's about bringing this very clear, simple, compelling story about why it makes sense that those two companies will come together, how they will build upon each other, how it will help and accelerate the corporate strategy, how it will help it accelerate in growth and so on. And it's, of course, not only the job of the CEO, it's the job of the whole leadership. Now, what I observe is that typically true communication starts at a moment of announcement. And there I see many CEOs doing it very well. They communicate to the organization through a town hall. They communicate through a press moment to the markets. They communicate to the customers. But where I do see the challenge is this notion of sustaining the communication. Very often these processes, even for small deals, can take 1, 2, God forbid, maybe 3 years, right? Because technical integration, regulatory approval, there are many things playing why at moments it takes really a long time. So demystifying the integration, making it, of course, two-way, right? Through town halls, Q&As, there are these days many means to do that.
Is there anything CEOs should be doing very specifically to retain talent during an M&A?
Most CEOs have this notion of I need to retain critical talent for sure on their radar. It's very often focused on the target company. They do not necessarily always think that this is also applicable to their own company. A 10-minute conversation or a 30-minute conversation with the CEO saying, look, we know you, we know what you bring to the company, and you're part of this future. We maybe do not yet know in which role and in which part of the company, but you're part of the future company. That means a lot to people. I think the second big element is thinking through your employee value proposition. In some cases, the acquisition will not change your employee value proposition, but still it is important to communicate and reconfirm. But in other cases, it will change it. And then maybe the third thing is notion to not to forget to engage the 95% of the organization, who honestly is also keeping the wheels turning, right? And so make sure to also engage with the 95% of the organization to explain what's happening.
How are companies turning to new tech like generative AI and others to help with that M&A?
Laurel, it is fair to say that M&A so far has been a reasonably manual process. But now I think with especially AI and also Gen AI, you do see a true step change in the making. See, already with AI, you can screen much more data sets, much more globally, and not only at company name level, but also at assets within those companies in a much more detailed way. I think that the second element is in the whole diligence and negotiation progress, making it less people intensive from, I would say, a number crunching and paper crunching point of view. And then But I probably find one of the most beautiful use cases is during the planning and the execution of an integration or a separation. It's what we have called the GenAI coach, where you have next to yourself a kind of a chat GPT type of application, but of course for M&A, which will give me the first answer, right? You still need to have the human check, but you have at least much faster starting point compared to only 1 or 2 years ago, right?
Is there one or two thematic pitfalls that happens with CEOs during M&As?
First of all, not taking decisions fast enough, because very often it are difficult decisions and they involve people. And then sometimes giving transparency sooner, even if it's maybe a painful decision, is more appreciated than letting people in the unknown for a longer period of time. I think the second pitfall I have sometimes seen is that the deal has been negotiated and then we delegate integration to the senior manager in all its facets. That's not what we would advise CEOs to do. There are a number of topics, culture, target operating model, leadership, composition, where you truly need to keep the decision-making yourself. And then maybe the third pitfall, and the other side of the pitfall, is building your leadership team. And I would say leadership team for me is your direct reports, the executive committee, but also the people who report into the executive committee. Maybe in some cases, none of the two executives are fit for purpose for the doubling in size of that company. And I have seen CEOs being very honest and very purposeful at that moment, bringing in external people to further refresh the leadership. And so that is also something which you as a CEO truly need to shape in such a journey.
Mika, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks a lot and have a nice day, everybody.
Thanks so much for listening to the McKinsey podcast. I'm Lucia Rahili.
And I'm Roberta Fasaro.
Find us on McKinsey.com. We'll have a transcript of this episode up shortly.
And download the McKinsey Insights app, where you can find this podcast and other helpful content updated daily.
If you enjoyed the show, we'd love for you to leave a rating and a review.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.